In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2022. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments whether you think death row inmates should be able to choose a final meal or not. On January 27, 2022, Donald Anthony Grant was executed by lethal injection. But the story behind that sentence began more than 2 decades earlier in Del City, Oklahoma. It was the middle of summer, July 18, 2001, when Donald walked into a La Quinta Inn pretending to ask for a job. But that was just a cover. What he actually wanted was money to bail out his girlfriend, and he was ready to kill to get it. Donald came prepared. He knew the layout of the hotel, the location of the cameras, and exactly where to go. This wasn't random. It was planned. Inside the front office stood 58-year-old Brenda McKillia, the manager. Donald pulled out a pistol and forced her into a storage room. There, he shot her in the head and then slashed her neck with a box cutter, testing the blade before moving on to his next target. Then he walked into the break room where 42-year-old Suzette Smith was on duty. Donald demanded money from the register, and she gave it to him, hoping it would be enough to save her life. But it wasn't. Donald marched her to the manager's office and shot her 3 times in the face. When she kept fighting for her life, he beat her, stabbed her, slammed her with a computer monitor, and tried to break her neck. She died in a pool of blood just feet from where Brenda had fallen. After the attack, Donald took items from Suzette's purse and walked to a nearby discount store, ditching the gun and some stolen traveler's checks. Then he called a cab to the home of Cheryl Tubbs. Later that same day, he used the money to bail out the other woman, Shlonda Gatewood, for just $200. A few hours later, they fled Oklahoma in a stolen car and drove all the way to New York. But the escape didn't last. Donald was arrested a month later and extradited back to Oklahoma to face what was coming. In August 2001, Donald was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of robbery. The state pushed for the death penalty because of aggravating factors. He killed more than 1 person, wanted to avoid arrest, was already a convicted felon, and posed a continuing threat to society. In Suzette's case, they added that the murder was heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Finally, in 2005, a jury ruled that he was competent, and later that same year, they found him guilty on all charges. Donald was sentenced to death for both murders and sent to death row, where he would remain for the next 16 years. As his execution date neared, Donald requested to die by firing squad, but that request was denied. On January 27, 2022, just after 10 a.m., Donald was strapped to the gurney at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Before his execution, he was offered his last meal: sesame chicken, 6 egg rolls, shrimp fried rice, and a large apple fritter for dessert. But when the fritter wasn't available, he asked for something else: 3 pints of strawberry ice cream. Whatever the combination, he was ready. When asked for final words, Donald's message came out fragmented. "Yo, God, I got this," he said. "Brooklyn for life." He added, "I'm going to go to the universe, and then I'll be back." His voice cracked mid-sentence. Then he started to cry. Even after the microphone was cut, he kept talking, mumbling to the witnesses behind the glass, as if searching for someone who could still hear him. At 10:09 a.m., a doctor leaned over and declared him unconscious. And a few minutes later, his breathing stopped. Donald Anthony Grant was 60 years old. Before the execution room even fell silent, another man was already waiting his turn. Just hours later, in Alabama, the next execution took place, and the story behind his crime was just as brutal. It was the night before Thanksgiving, November 27, 1996, in Selma, Alabama. Matthew Reeves and a few friends had plans that night, not to celebrate the holiday, but to rob a drug dealer. But their plans fell apart when their car broke down on the side of the road. That's when Willie Johnson, a stranger just trying to help, happened to drive by in his pickup truck. He saw the group stranded and offered to tow them home. Matthew climbed into the bed of the truck, and it should have ended there, with a thank you. But instead, it ended in blood. When they pulled into the driveway, Matthew reached through the back window, raised a shotgun, and pulled the trigger. He shot Willie point blank, killing him instantly. Then he took Willie's money, climbed out, and left him slumped over the wheel of his own truck. By the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, Willie's body was still in the truck, right where it had been left. And while his family had no idea what had happened, Matthew was back at a party laughing and mocking the way Willie died. Witnesses saw him pretending to pump a shotgun, acting out the moment he pulled the trigger like it was some kind of joke. But the clock was ticking. Just hours later, police tracked Matthew down and arrested him. His brother, Julius, and his friend Brenda were also taken in. But when the questioning started, both claimed that Matthew was the one who pulled the trigger. And in July 1998, the court agreed. Matthew was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The other two were sentenced to life without parole. Over the years, Matthew's legal team fought to overturn the sentence, pointing to his intellectual disability, noting that his IQ tested in the 60s, well below average. They argued he couldn't fully grasp what he was doing, not during the crime, and not when he stood in court facing the consequences. But the courts didn't agree, and just one day before he was scheduled to die, the U.S. Supreme Court gave the green light. On January 27, 2022, Matthew Reeves was put to death by lethal injection in Alabama. He spent 23 years on death row. He declined to speak any final words, and he didn't request a last meal, so he ate the same thing the other prisoners ate. Afterwards, the drugs were administered, and he was pronounced dead at 9:24 p.m. Matthew Reeves was 44 years old. With the January executions completed, the next one was scheduled for February 17th. Let's take a look at what this death row inmate did. It was Memorial Day, May 30th, 2005, when Gilbert Postelle picked up an AK-47, climbed into a vehicle with his brother, his father, and a friend, and set out for a trailer home in Oklahoma City. Gilbert believed that one of the people there, Donnie Swindle, had caused his father's motorcycle crash. There was no evidence, no solid proof, but to Gilbert, that didn't matter. And what came next was planned and brutal. When they arrived, the four victims, Donnie Swindle, James Alderson, Terry Smith, and Amy Wright, were forced into the yard where they were told to kneel. Then Gilbert opened fire, spraying over 30 rounds from the AK-47. In the chaos, two victims tried to run, but Gilbert shot them in the back. All four died in a matter of minutes. Police would later call it a blitz attack. Sudden, brutal, and over almost as quickly as it began. Afterward, Gilbert ditched the weapons and disappeared, thinking he could vanish without a trace. But investigators tracked the getaway van to Indiana. And a few months later, Gilbert was arrested. For the killings of Amy Wright and James Alderson, he was given 2 death sentences. For the other 2 victims, he received life without parole. His brother, David, was also convicted but got life in prison. Their father, Brad, never faced trial. The crash had left him with severe brain damage, and he was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial. He died in 2011, never answering for his role in the crimes. At trial, Gilbert's defense attorney painted a grim picture: a low IQ, a childhood shaped by a violent, drug-addicted father, and a mother who abandoned him early on. By the time he was 12, Gilbert was using meth daily, and by the time he was 18, he'd been arrested multiple times. On the stand, Gilbert himself said he didn't remember much from the murders, only that he was high and confused. "I do understand that I'm guilty," he told the board. "I'm truly sorry." But for the families, an apology wasn't enough. And for the parole board, it wasn't convincing. Gilbert spent 13 years on death row. On the morning of February 17, 2022, Gilbert sat down to his last meal. McDonald's, 20 chicken nuggets, 3 large fries, 2 chicken sandwiches, a cola, and a caramel frappe. He declined to say any last words. At 10:14 a.m., lethal injection ended his sentence in Oklahoma. Gilbert Postelle was 35 years old. Let's fast forward to April 2022, when the next execution was scheduled. Let's look at what this death row inmate did. On June 27, 1990, in Houston, Texas, what started as a routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare. Officer James Barbee had pulled over a car, expecting nothing out of the ordinary, but in the passenger seat sat Carl Wayne Buntion, a man with a long criminal record and a history of violence. As Officer Barbee spoke with the driver, Carl quietly stepped out of the passenger side, and without warning, he aimed a .357 Magnum revolver and shot Officer Barbee in the head. When the officer collapsed onto the pavement, Carl fired 2 more shots into his back, then took off running. Along the way, he fired at bystanders, aimed at other officers, and tried to carjack a stranger. He even threatened another person at gunpoint before finally barricading himself inside a nearby building. Police surrounded him, and that's where it ended. But this wasn't random. At the time, Carl was out on parole after serving just over a year of a 15-year sentence for sexually assaulting a child. He had told people he'd rather die in a shootout than go back to prison. And that night, he made good on that threat. Except he didn't die. In 1991, a Texas jury found Carl guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. That sentence was later overturned in 2009, but a second jury resentenced him to death in 2012. His attorneys argued that Carl had changed in prison. He was no longer a threat, they said. He was old, frail, and filled with regret. He had been diagnosed with vertigo, nerve pain, arthritis, and even needed a wheelchair at times. And he also claimed to have found religion during his decades on death row. In the days leading up to his execution, Carl even caught pneumonia and later suffered a head injury when a prison transport vehicle stopped suddenly. But the courts didn't see enough reason to stop the execution. On April 21, 2022, 31 years after the crime, Carl sat strapped to the gurney inside the Huntsville unit. He wasn't allowed to ask for a special meal and ate what was on the menu that night. He used his final words to apologize to the Barbee family. "I do have remorse for what I did," he said. "I pray to God they get closure." Then he added, "I'm ready to go to heaven, Warden." Outside, a group of motorcyclists gathered in tribute to Officer Barbee, who had been a motorcycle cop. As Carl took his final breath, they revved their engines, a roaring tribute that shook the walls of the execution chamber. It was the last sound he ever heard. He was 78 years old, and until that moment, he held the title of Texas's oldest death row inmate. While one life ended, the next man was already waiting for his execution, and his story began with a single, brutal decision that claimed 2 lives in one day. It was August 27, 1996, in DeSoto, Missouri, when Carman Deck knocked on the door of James and Zelma Long. He told them he needed directions, but that was a lie. Once inside, Carman pulled a gun, forced the couple to the floor, and robbed them. Then he shot both of them execution style. When it was over, he and his sister Tanya took their cash and their car, driving away as if nothing had happened. Police caught Carman a few days later. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, armed criminal action, robbery, and burglary. In 1998, a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. For his final meal, Carman ordered a ribeye steak, shrimp, asparagus, a salad with Italian dressing, cottage cheese, and V8 juice. Before the drugs were administered, he gave a written statement. "My hope is that one day the world will find peace and that we all will learn to be kind and loving to one another. We all are a part of this journey through life, connected in every way. Please give love, show love, be love." Carman had spent 23 years on death row when on May 3, 2022, lethal injection ended his sentence in Missouri. He was 56 years old. And while that night marked the end of a decades-long legal battle, another case was already making headlines, one where the killer showed no hesitation, no mercy, and no regret. Let's take a look. It was January 7, 1978, in Tempe, Arizona, when 21-year-old Deanna Bodoin was found murdered in her apartment. She had been strangled with a belt, stabbed multiple times, and sexually assaulted. The scene was brutal, and it was her boyfriend who discovered her walking into a nightmare just hours after Deanna had returned home from a night out. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate suspects, and no clear motive. Deanna didn't have enemies. She wasn't in danger, at least no one thought she was. And just like that, the trail went cold. For more than 20 years, her case sat unsolved. No answers, no justice. Just a grieving family left to wonder who had taken her life and why. Then in 2001, a DNA hit changed everything. Clarence Dixon, who was already serving a life sentence for a separate 1986 sexual assault, was matched to semen left at the scene. At the time of Deanna's murder, Clarence had lived just across the street, which can explain why she let him in. And that was not it. He had a history of violence stretching back to the 70s, including an assault with a metal pipe on a teenage girl. And just 2 days before Deanna was killed, he'd been declared not guilty by reason of insanity. In 2008, Clarence was charged and convicted of first-degree murder. The rape charge was dropped due to a legal time limit. During his trial, his attorneys argued he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and hallucinations, and that he was legally blind. But none of it stopped the verdict. He was sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row, as Arizona temporarily paused executions after a botched lethal injection in 2014. As the state prepared to resume, Clarence became the first in line. He declined to choose his method of execution, so the state defaulted to lethal injection. For his final meal, he chose Kentucky Fried Chicken, strawberry ice cream, and bottled water. In his last words, Clarence addressed the victim. "Maybe I'll see you on the other side, Deanna. I don't know you, and I don't remember you." He also blamed the Arizona Supreme Court and repeated his innocence. On May 11, 2022, at 10:19 a.m., the drugs began to flow. There was one final gasp, and then silence. He was pronounced dead at 10:30 a.m. Clarence Dixon was 66 years old. The next man in line had waited decades too, but his crime was in broad daylight and haunted a city ever since. Let's take a look. On September 17, 1984, 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson rode off on her bike to drop a birthday card in the mail. Her mother had finally allowed her to go alone just this once. It was supposed to take only a few minutes, but 20 minutes passed and Vicki still hadn't come back. Worried, her older sister went out to look for her. But instead of finding Vicki, she found her bike lying abandoned near the elementary school. No sign of Vicki, no clue where she'd gone. But someone had seen something. A witness told police about a man in a dark car parked near the school. He had backed into a telephone pole and was acting strangely, making crude gestures at children. That witness wrote down the license plate number, which led the police straight to Frank Atwood, a 28-year-old man from California with a disturbing past. At the time, Frank was already on parole for molesting an 8-year-old boy. When questioned, he admitted he'd been in the area, claimed his car broke down, and said he went off to buy drugs around the time Vicki disappeared. But that story quickly fell apart. Several witnesses told police Frank came back with blood on his clothes, and then came the physical evidence. At the crime scene, investigators found pink paint from Vicki's bike on the bumper of Frank's car. They also discovered chrome from the grill of his car transferred onto the frame of her bike. And nearby, a mailbox showed fresh damage, struck at the exact height of a car bumper. It all pointed back to Frank. But one thing was missing. His clothes from that day were never found. And that gap left a chilling question. What else was he trying to hide? Then, 7 months later, a hiker stumbled across human remains in the desert, 20 miles outside Tucson. The body was nothing but bone by then, but dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Vicki. The damage was too severe to reveal exactly how she died, but there was no question now that she was gone. Frank had already been arrested just 10 days after Vicki's disappearance and was charged with kidnapping. Once her remains were found, the charges shifted to murder. On March 26, 1987, a jury found him guilty, and on May 8th, he was sentenced to death. Frank would go on to spend 35 years on death row. During that time, he never stopped claiming he was innocent. He accused investigators of tampering with evidence and said he was a changed man. He even got married behind bars, and he joined the Greek Orthodox Church, earned multiple college degrees, and even published books. But none of it mattered in the end. His death sentence stood. Frank didn't choose a method of execution, so the state defaulted to lethal injection. At first, he declined a last meal, saying he was fasting, but later he changed his mind and accepted a standard tray. It came with slices of salami, mustard, peanut butter, and jelly, wheat bread, a bag of tortilla chips, and water with a powdered juice packet. His final words were filled with scripture and gratitude, but he offered no apology to Vicky's family. "Thank you, precious Father, for coming today and shepherding me into faith. I pray the Lord will have mercy on all of us, and that the Lord will have mercy on me." Frank Atwood was pronounced dead at 10:16 a.m. on June 8, 2022. Some say killing a child should always lead to execution. Do you agree? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's continue with the next case. It was August 15, 1994, in Birmingham, Alabama. Faith Hall had just finished shopping with a friend. It was a normal afternoon, until it turned into a nightmare. They returned to the friend's apartment, unaware that Joe James, her ex-boyfriend, had been following them. When they spotted his car, panic set in. Faith, her friend, and her friend's children ran inside and pushed furniture against the door, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. Joe forced his way in, a gun in his hand and rage in his eyes. Faith tried to calm him down and pleaded with him to stop, for the kids, for everyone's safety. But Joe wasn't there to talk. He raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Once, twice, 3 times. Faith turned and ran, but he kept firing. The final shot hit her after she had already collapsed, as if he wanted to make sure she'd never get back up. Their relationship had ended months before, but Joe couldn't let her go. He kept calling her nonstop. He parked in her driveway, and he threatened to kill her. She was scared, and she had every reason to be. Over time, she filed 4 police reports, each one a desperate attempt to get help, but none of them stopped what happened that afternoon when he executed his threats. A jury convicted Joe of capital murder in 1996, and the judge gave him death. He would spend the next 25 years on death row, and he converted to Islam during that time. His final appeal argued that he hadn't been given a fair chance to choose nitrogen gas as his method of execution, but this was denied. So was clemency, even though Faith's daughters, just toddlers when she was killed, had begged the state not to execute the man who took their mother. They said they had forgiven him. On the day of his death, July 28th, Joe refused a special final meal, and when breakfast came, grits, eggs, jelly, biscuits, orange juice, and bread, he didn't touch it. He also refused to speak any final words. But what happened inside the death chamber that night raised more questions than answers. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m., but Joe wasn't pronounced dead until 9:27 p.m., more than 3 hours later. A private autopsy later found signs of multiple failed IV attempts and deep punctures through muscle. Witnesses couldn't confirm whether Joe had been conscious, since his eyes were closed the entire time and his body never moved. He was executed by lethal injection in Alabama. Joe Nathan James Jr. was 50 years old. And as the clock ticked forward, another death row inmate stepped into the chamber just 2 weeks later. But what did he do? On July 8, 2006, the man calling himself Chan Lee phoned a real estate agent, Mamie Sharpless, from a payphone. He said he'd just moved from North Carolina and wanted to tour a townhome in the Craig Ranch neighborhood. Mamie and her husband made the drive, parked near the model home, and waited. Soon, a white Mustang pulled up. The man behind the wheel claimed he wasn't Chan Lee, but something about him didn't sit right. His buzz-cut, stocky build, and jittery energy stuck with Mamie. And later, she'd recognize that same man in a courtroom. Around 1:10 p.m., a couple stepped into the D.R. Horton model home and immediately sensed something was wrong. The place was ripped apart, furniture overturned, and blood was pooling in the dining room. The trail led into the kitchen. There, on the tile floor, lay the body of Sarah Walker, a 40-year-old real estate agent. She had been stabbed 33 times, beaten in the face, and even bitten on the neck. The autopsy told the rest of the story: defensive wounds across her arms, a broken nose, and shattered teeth. This wasn't just an attack, it was a frenzy. Sarah had been wearing a Rolex that morning, but by the time police arrived, it was gone. And so was a ring. Back at her home, they found the box and receipt still sitting where she left them. But the watch itself? It was never found. At the scene, investigators uncovered a bloody fingerprint on the front door, and beneath Sarah's fingernails, they found traces of DNA, all pointing to one man, Kosoul Chanthakoummane. He was arrested in early September, and when questioned, he had a story ready. He claimed his car had broken down near the model home and that he only stepped inside to get some water. As for the blood, he said the cuts on his hands were old. Maybe that's how it got there. But the jury didn't buy it. At trial, a forensic dentist testified that the bite mark on Sarah's neck could only have come from Kosoul, and DNA experts backed it up. His defense team tried to fight it, but nothing stuck. In the end, the jury didn't hesitate. He was guilty of capital murder. They agreed he'd killed her during a robbery, and he'd used a deadly weapon to do it. During the punishment phase of the trial, jurors got a deeper look at Kosoul's past, and it wasn't easy to hear. They learned about violent assaults, gang involvement, a kidnapping, and an armed robbery during a home invasion. He had already served prison time before this murder, but his defense team tried to show another side. They described him as quiet, artistic, and well-behaved behind bars. A psychologist testified that he wasn't a future threat, saying he could live out a life sentence without causing harm. But the jury didn't agree. They came back with their decision: death. And Kosoul would spend the next 14 years on death row, waiting. Then, on August 17, 2022, inside the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas, he looked through the glass and locked eyes with the one person still standing by him: his mother. "Mom, I love you," he mouthed. She waved back. "I love you," she said. He thanked Jesus, the prison ministers, and those who stood with him. "To Mrs. Walker's family," he said, "I pray that my death will bring them peace." He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal, so he just ate the same thing the other inmates ate. Pentobarbital flowed through both arms. He took 4 breaths, gasped, and fell still. He was pronounced dead at 6:33 p.m. Kosoul Chanthakoummane was 41 years old. And it wasn't long before another inmate was executed. Let's look at what he did and what he chose for his final meal. On March 6, 1997, in Oklahoma City, Albert Hale, just a week shy of turning 74, was spending a quiet morning at home watching TV with a younger friend and co-worker named James Coddington. The two had worked together for years. Albert was known for his routines, his calm presence, and his generosity. James, just 24 at the time, was spiraling, deep in a cocaine relapse and chasing a high that wouldn't let up. Earlier that morning, James had robbed a convenience store, but it hadn't brought in enough. So he went to someone he trusted, Albert, and he asked him for money. But Albert said no and told James he needed to stop using drugs. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, he just gave a calm, honest answer. And those few words were the last thing he ever said. As James turned to leave, something caught his eye, a hammer lying nearby. He grabbed it, turned back, and in a sudden burst of violence began swinging. He struck Albert in the head again and again, not stopping until the man who had once helped him was lying lifeless. Then James took $520 from the house, walked out the door, and disappeared, all because of a high and one man's refusal to feed it. By the time his name came up again, James Coddington had already robbed more than 6 gas stations and stores. But the spree didn't last long, as he was arrested the next day. But the road that brought him there had been brutal from the start. James was one of 9 siblings. His mother spent most of his childhood in prison, and his father was an alcoholic who did more damage than good. He fed James beer in baby bottles, beat him until he bled, and spent every dollar on alcohol. James grew up hungry, digging through dumpsters for scraps just to stay alive. By age 7, his father was gone too. Then came foster care, petty crime, and eventually addiction, a cycle he never escaped. By the time he went to trial in 2003 for Albert Hale's murder, James was already serving 6 life sentences for a string of robberies. The jury didn't hesitate. They sentenced him to death. But on death row, James changed. He kept to himself, avoided trouble, and slowly began to rebuild what was left of him. He earned his GED, stayed off drugs, and tried, at least behind the walls, to become someone different than the man who picked up that hammer. But his execution date stood. On the morning of August 25, 2022, James sat strapped to a gurney in McAllister. For a final meal, he had chosen 2 cheeseburgers, 2 fish sandwiches, fries, and a large soda. Looking at the witnesses, James said, "To all my family and friends, lawyers, everyone who's been around me and loved me, thank you. Governor Stitt, I don't blame you, and I forgive you." He never mentioned Albert by name. The drugs entered his system, and at 10:16 a.m., James Coddington was declared dead. He was 50 years old. He was gone, and it wasn't long before another name followed. But what did he do to deserve the death penalty? On July 19, 2004, Pablo Castro was wrapping up another shift at the Times Market in Corpus Christi, Texas. It was routine, just taking out the trash behind the store, likely thinking about heading home. But from the shadows, John Ramirez stepped forward, a knife in his hand and violence in his eyes. John had once served in the U.S. Marines. He had training, discipline, and he knew exactly how to kill. And that night, he used it. He stabbed Pablo 29 times, leaving him bleeding and broken behind the store for less than $2. He didn't even bother to go inside the store. Then he ran. His 2 accomplices were arrested the next day, but John vanished into Mexico. For the next 4 years, he disappeared. But in 2008, police found him. His trial was quick. The evidence was clear, the motive empty. The jury didn't need much convincing, and John Ramirez was sentenced to die. On October 5, 2022, nearly 2 decades after Pablo's murder, John lay strapped to a gurney inside the Huntsville unit's execution chamber. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had whatever was served that day. His pastor stood beside him with his hand over his heart, whispering prayers as the execution team prepared the IV lines. Through the window, 5 members of Pablo Castro's family watched. John spoke directly to them in his final statement. "I tried to reply back, but there is nothing that I could have said or done that would have helped you," he said. "I have regret and remorse. This is such a heinous act. I hope this finds you comfort. I hope in some shape or form this helps you find closure." He turned his thoughts to those he loved. "To my wife, my friends, my son, Grasshopper, Dana, and homies, I love y'all. I fought a good fight, and I am ready to go. I am ready, Warden." At 6:27 p.m., the drugs began to flow. John took a few short breaths, then started to snore. Less than a minute later, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:41 p.m. John Henry Ramirez was 38 years old. And while this execution had just ended, another death row inmate was already waiting until it was his turn. But what did he do? It happened just days before Christmas, on December 20th, 2002. Benjamin Cole sat in the living room with his baby daughter, Brianna, who was only 9 months old. She was just a baby, crying the way babies do. But Benjamin wasn't in a stable place. He had relapsed into drug use, and his mind was clouded, erratic. Earlier that same day, he'd already robbed a store, desperate for money to keep feeding his addiction. And that night, as Brianna cried on, something inside him snapped. Whatever sense of control he had left was gone. Brianna was lying face down when he grabbed her by the ankles. Then, with brutal force, he shoved her legs toward her head, folding her body until her spine snapped in two and her aorta tore open. The injury was brutal and killed her almost instantly. But instead of calling for help, Benjamin sat down and played video games. His wife, growing more anxious by the minute, begged him to do something, but he brushed her off. By the time emergency workers arrived, Brianna was already gone, and Benjamin said nothing. It wasn't until after the autopsy revealed the truth that he finally admitted what he'd done. And when detectives told him her death was ruled a homicide, his response wasn't shock or remorse. It was cold calculation. "How many years am I looking at?" he asked. But it wasn't going to be years. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. And this wasn't the first time Benjamin had crossed the line. Years earlier, he'd been convicted of abusing his infant son. The jury didn't just see a killer, they saw a pattern, and they called Brianna's murder especially cruel. For nearly 2 decades, Benjamin stayed on death row. His lawyers argued he was mentally ill and should not be executed. They said he was delusional, lost in his own world, unfit to understand what was happening. But the courts disagreed. They said he knew right from wrong, and the execution would move forward. On the morning of October 20th, 2022, Benjamin refused a spiritual advisor. He didn't want his lawyers present either. Guards said he called himself a super-duper hyperbolic Jesus freak who thought he was a messiah and he would resurrect in 3 days. For his last meal, he chose a religious menu, vegetarian lasagna, a salad, a tortilla, and a fruit drink packet. In his final words, he didn't speak to Brianna's family. Instead, he delivered a 2-minute religious speech. "Choose Jesus while you still can," he said. "Keep your eyes peeled. Be ready at all times." Then he asked Jesus to receive his spirit. Benjamin was executed by lethal injection at 10:22 a.m. He was 57 years old. Oof, that was brutal. But wait until you hear what the next man did. It was November 2003 in White House, a quiet patch of East Texas. Tracy Beatty had just moved back in with his mother, 62-year-old Carolyn Click. It wasn't the first time they'd lived together, and it wasn't the first time things had gone wrong. Their relationship had always been rocky, constant arguments, long silences, and sudden outbursts that could shift from tense to explosive in seconds. But that day, the fight didn't end in silence. It ended in murder. Inside her trailer home, after another heated argument, Tracy strangled his own mother. There was no call for help, no attempt to save her. Instead, he buried Carolyn in a shallow grave behind the house, covered it up, and walked away like nothing had happened. In the days that followed, he emptied her bank account, bought drugs, and drank himself into oblivion. As if her life and her death meant nothing at all. When police eventually found Carolyn's body hidden just steps from the back door, all eyes turned to her son. Tracy was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder. Prosecutors told the jury this wasn't just a killing. It was cold, calculated, and cruel. Tracy didn't report her death. He just buried her like trash and went on living as if she'd never existed. Tracy had a violent past and wasn't new to prison. He had served time before for injuring others, including his own family. So when the jury heard the details of what he'd done to his mother, they didn't hesitate. In 2004, a judge made it official. Tracy Beatty would die by lethal injection. Over the years, he faced 3 execution dates, each one delayed. But after 18 years on death row, the end finally came. On November 9, 2022, Tracy was executed at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had whatever was served that day. That evening, he was led into the chamber with a long white beard and shoulder-length gray hair. A prison chaplain placed a hand on his chest and said a short prayer. When asked for final words, Tracy choked up. His voice cracked as he looked through the glass at his wife. "I just want to thank," he said, struggling to hold back tears. "I don't want to leave you, baby. See you when you get there. I love you." He mouthed a kiss. Then he turned his thoughts to others on death row. "I love you, brothers. See you on the other side." Then the sedative kicked in. Tracy took 2 deep breaths, mumbled something no one could understand, and then began to snore. 17 minutes later, at 6:39 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Tracy Beatty was 61 years old. And just 7 days later, the next execution was scheduled. But what did he do? It was New Year's Eve, 1980, in Phoenix, Arizona. Inside a quiet home, William Redmond, his wife Marilyn, and her mother Helen Phelps were wrapping up the day, prepping food, tidying up, and getting ready for a small gathering to ring in the new year. Around 8 p.m., someone knocked at the door. William answered, thinking it was one of their guests, but it wasn't. And seconds later, everything changed. 3 men forced their way inside, no masks, just guns and cold intentions. Marilyn was pulled from the kitchen and shoved into the bedroom, where she saw her mother already face down on the bed with her hands tied. The intruders wanted guns and cash. William gave them a wallet, and Marilyn told them where the rest of the money was. But it didn't matter. The 3 were tied up and gagged with socks from a dresser drawer. One of the men said, "We don't need them anymore." And just like that, the night turned from celebration to pure horror. William was shot in the head, so was Helen. Marilyn was shot last, but she didn't die. She survived, but barely. And her survival would start one of Arizona's longest and most controversial capital cases. She told police she'd seen the men's faces, and she identified all 3. Edward McCall, a former cop, William Bracey, and Murray Hooper. Police quickly claimed it wasn't a random robbery. They called it a contract killing, part of a business conspiracy. Over the years, the case unraveled into a web of accusations, botched trials, and overturned convictions. One of the alleged masterminds was murdered. Another walked free after 5 trials. One conspirator got a deal and walked free, and 2 of the actual killers died in prison. But Murray Hooper outlived them all. He spent 40 years on death row, holding firm to his claim of innocence until the very end. His lawyers fought hard. They argued that no physical evidence tied him to the crime scene, that Marilyn's description of the suspects had changed more than once, and that her testimony was shaky and likely influenced by police. But none of it mattered in the end. It wasn't enough to stop what came next. On November 16, 2022, Murray was taken from his cell to the execution chamber at Florence State Prison. For his final meal, he chose KFC, mac and cheese, cheesecake, and ice cream. Witnesses watched as the execution team struggled to find a vein. Murray turned toward the gallery and said, "Can you believe this?" Then again, "What's taking so long?" A second medical kit was brought in, and eventually the team inserted the IV line through his femoral vein, a painful process that left visible blood. No one from the victims' families came to watch, and none of Murray's people were there either. Before it started, Murray spoke one last time. His voice was steady. "It's all been said. Let it be done. To all my lawyers and loved ones, don't be sad for me. Don't cry. Don't say goodbye, but say, 'I'll see you later. Let's go.'" 10 minutes later, at 10:34 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Murray Hooper was 76. But that wasn't all, as another execution was scheduled for that same day. In Texas, Stephen Barbee was waiting for his final moments. But what did he do? It was February 2005, and Lisa Underwood had every reason to smile. She was 8 months pregnant, planning her baby shower, and surrounded by friends who couldn't wait to celebrate the new arrival. Her family had everything ready, but Lisa never showed up. The last time anyone saw her was that Saturday morning. Lisa lived in a cozy home with her 7-year-old son, Jaden. When police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. Jaden's shoes were still by the fireplace, right where he always left them. His glasses sat untouched next to his bed. But in the living room, something was horribly wrong. There was blood on the rug, on the furniture, enough to know something terrible had happened inside that house. Just 2 counties over, a deputy spotted a man walking alone down a muddy service road. He was soaked, filthy, and acting strange. When the deputy stopped him, the man gave a fake name, then bolted. That man was Stephen Barbee. Stephen had dated Lisa the year before, and after finding out she was pregnant, she told him the baby was his. He denied it, claimed he'd had a vasectomy, but his behavior told another story. First, he panicked. Then he started planning. That same weekend, Lisa's SUV was found submerged in a creek. The windows were rolled down, the hatch was open, and cleaning supplies were scattered in the back. And the location? Not far from where Stephen ran from that deputy. It was clear he wasn't lost. He was covering his tracks. When detectives finally caught up with him, Stephen denied everything, claimed he hadn't seen Lisa in months. But the truth came out, in a police station bathroom of all places, with a detective standing right next to him. Stephen quietly confessed. He said he'd held Lisa face down into the carpet, smothering her until she stopped breathing. Then he turned to Jaden, just 7 years old. He put his hand over the boy's nose and mouth and kept it there until Jaden was gone too. Stephen said Lisa was going to ruin his life, his marriage, and his image. So instead of facing it, he killed them both. After confessing, Stephen led detectives to a shallow grave where he had buried both Lisa and Jaden side by side. By then, the damage was done. A jury listened as prosecutors laid it all out, how he had lied, fled, and then personally guided police to their bodies. His own words, his knowledge of details no one else could have known, painted a picture the jury believed. At sentencing, prosecutors revealed more. His ex-wife, Teresa, took the stand and described 4 separate times Stephen assaulted her. There was a road rage attack and a case of verbal harassment toward a former coworker who had turned him down. He had a pattern: control, rage, and violence when things didn't go his way. The jury saw it clearly and found him guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. On November 16, 2022, nearly 18 years after Lisa, Jaden, and the unborn child died, Stephen was led to the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and ate what everybody ate that day. He declined to speak with his lawyers and any special witnesses. He just thanked God, his minister, and his loved ones. "I just want everyone to have peace in their heart. Make eternity with Jesus. Give him the glory in everything you do. I'm ready." The lethal dose of pentobarbital entered his system at 7:09 p.m. He was pronounced dead at 7:35. Stephen Barbee was 55. He was gone, but death row wasn't done yet. Just 1 day later, the next execution was scheduled. But what did he do, and what were his final moments like? Let's take a look. On November 13, 1993, 3-year-old Adam Broomhall had already been tucked into bed by his aunt when she left the house that night. His mother, Stacy, was asleep. But her boyfriend, Richard Fairchild, a former Marine, was wide awake and drunk. He'd been drinking since early afternoon, and by nightfall, he was deep into his second six-pack. At some point that night, he made an unwanted pass at Stacy's 17-year-old sister. When she refused, he didn't just lash out. He threatened to kill whoever came to pick her up. And then, hours later, Adam started crying. The sound set something off in Richard. At first, he tried yelling, but it didn't stop. So he snapped, he hit Adam. Once, then again. He smashed the boy's face, rupturing his lip and busting his eardrum. But that wasn't enough for Richard. He grabbed the little boy and pressed his chest and backside against a wall heater, burning his skin. Adam screamed, but Richard didn't stop. The more the little boy cried, the more violent Richard became, his rage building with every sound, every sob, every plea for it to end. Later, when questioned by detectives, Richard Fairchild admitted, "I think I pushed him up against the heater and held him up there." But that wasn't the end. The final blow came when Richard threw Adam against a folding table. That's when the little boy stopped breathing. When Adam's mother woke up and saw what had happened, Richard finally called 911. Doctors tried everything to save him, but it was too late. Adam died at the hospital, his small body covered in bruises. The autopsy revealed 26 separate injuries, some to his head, others scattered across his limbs and torso. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma. At first, Richard claimed Adam had fallen, said he'd run into the table while playing, but the injuries didn't match the story. And when confronted with the facts, he confessed. He said the boy wouldn't stop crying, said the alcohol had taken over. But those words didn't erase what he'd done. The trial came 2 years later, and prosecutors didn't just talk about what happened, they focused on how he did it. The burns on Adam's body, the relentless beatings, the way Richard went cold and quiet afterward, like nothing had happened. The jury listened as a psychiatrist explained how years of drinking had damaged Richard's mind, but it wasn't enough to sway them. In 1996, the jury delivered their verdict. Richard Fairchild was sentenced to death. The appeal process stretched on for decades. Over the years, Richard's attorneys would argue he'd suffered brain damage, that his past, marked by abuse, alcoholism, and trauma, had set him on a path toward destruction. But courts rejected the claims. Supporters believed he'd changed. They said prison had softened him, that he prayed every day for Adam, and that he carried deep regret for what he'd done. But in the end, none of it was enough to stop the execution. On November 17, 2022, Richard Fairchild turned 63 years old. He spent his final birthday alone on death row, waiting for the clock to run out. For his last meal, he chose 2 quarter-pounders with cheese, large fries, a Coke, a pumpkin pie, and a pint of chocolate ice cream. That morning, inside the death chamber in McAlester, Oklahoma, Richard Fairchild faced his final moments. When asked if he had any last words, he spoke softly. "Today is a day for Adam, justice for Adam." He turned to Adam's mother and grandmother and apologized, said he'd lived with the guilt for 29 years. He thanked his attorneys, the prison staff, and told those watching not to grieve for him. "I'm at peace with God," he said. "I'm going home to be with my Heavenly Father." At 10:11 a.m., the lethal drugs began flowing through his veins, and 13 minutes later, at 10:24, Richard Fairchild was pronounced dead. That was brutal. Now let's see what the next death row inmate did and what he chose for his final meal. On July 5, 2005, in the Meacham Park neighborhood of Kirkwood, Missouri, 19-year-old Kevin Johnson made a decision that would end one life and seal the fate of his own. That afternoon, police came looking for Kevin over a probation violation. As officers moved through his home, Kevin's 12-year-old brother, known by his nickname Bam Bam, suddenly collapsed in the next room. Kevin would later say that officers ignored the emergency, too focused on him to notice his brother's medical crisis. Bam Bam was rushed to the hospital, but he didn't make it. And by that night, Kevin's grief had curdled into rage. He didn't just mourn his brother, he blamed the police for his death. And that anger was about to turn deadly. Around 7:30 p.m., just hours after his little brother died, Kevin Johnson saw a familiar face pull into the neighborhood. Sergeant William McEntee, a 43-year-old police officer, had returned on an unrelated fireworks call. He parked his cruiser near the same streets he'd patrolled for years, but this time, Kevin was waiting. He walked up to the patrol car and, without a word, pulled out a gun and opened fire. Sergeant McEntee was hit multiple times, but managed to drive a short distance before crashing his car into a tree. But Kevin wasn't finished. He followed the wrecked cruiser, stood outside, took aim, and fired the final shots. William McEntee died later at the hospital, and Kevin was arrested shortly after and charged with first-degree murder. In 2007, a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. But the case didn't end there. Over the years, Kevin's attorneys raised concerns about racism in how death sentences were handed out. They pointed to the former prosecutor's record, how he'd pushed for the death penalty more often when black defendants were accused of killing white victims. The courts reviewed those claims, but in the end, they didn't stop the execution. Kevin Johnson spent 17 years on death row. When his final day came, Kevin declined a final meal and ate nothing before the execution, fearing he would defecate when the lethal injection was administered. When asked if he had anything to say, Kevin simply said, "No comment." But moments before the drugs were administered, he spoke quietly with Reverend Darrell Gray, a spiritual advisor who was allowed in the room. They read scripture and prayed. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "Although my fight is over, the fight for this cause is never dying. Continue to stand up to racism. Continue to change the narrative." According to the Reverend, Kevin said he was ready. He said he was looking forward to seeing Bam Bam again. Kevin Johnson was executed by lethal injection in Missouri on November 29, 2022. He was pronounced dead at 7:40 p.m. He was 37 years old. And that brings us to the last death row inmate executed in 2022. On June 22, 2000, in the small town of Dorsey, Mississippi, 16-year-old Lisa Gray never made it home from her summer job. She'd just finished her shift at her uncle's restaurant when her car got a flat tire. It was late and she was alone. And that's when Thomas Loden pulled up. He was 35, a Marine Corps recruiter, and he told her not to worry. He was there to help. He told her he was a Marine, but what came next was anything but honorable. Thomas forced Lisa into his van, and for the next several hours he held her captive. He raped her, recorded some of the assault, and as the sun rose, he killed her, strangling and suffocating her until she stopped breathing. Then, like she meant nothing, he shoved her body under a seat, leaving her bound, lifeless, and stripped of everything. Later that same day, police found Thomas by the side of the road covered in blood. His wrists were slashed, and carved into his chest were two chilling words: "I'm sorry." When officers searched his van, they discovered Lisa's lifeless body. Thomas confessed immediately. He didn't even ask for a jury trial. In September 2001, he pleaded guilty to rape, sexual battery, and capital murder. The judge sentenced him to death and added 150 years for the other charges. Thomas spent 21 years on death row, waiting for the sentence he never fought. For his last meal, he requested fried pork chops, fried okra, a baked sweet potato, peach cobbler with French vanilla ice cream, biscuits with molasses, and a Lipton sweet tea. According to the staff, he finished all of it. Just before the chemicals flowed, Thomas spoke directly to Lisa's family. He said he hoped they would find peace, and he apologized again. Then he ended with 3 quiet words in Japanese: "I love you." Thomas was declared dead at 6:12 p.m. on December 14, 2022. Thomas Loden Jr. was 58 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in 2022. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.